My sister announced her fourth pregnancy and said, "The kids are coming to live with you for a few months until I give birth." I refused and left. A week later, she left them at my door and called the police when I called her crazy. Well, here we go. My name is Katya. I'm 32. And I work as a senior developer at a large Russian IT company with a Moscow office. It's a good thing I work remotely from my hometown of Khabarovsk. I don't have to travel to the capital, so I can work from home. But for some reason, my relatives have decided that working remotely is synonymous with being a perpetual nanny. I have retired parents who live in a private house in the northern part of the city, and an older sister, Irina. She's 37 and got divorced 2 years ago. She has 3 children. Sasha is 9. Emma is 7. And Tioma is 6. After the divorce, Irka went crazy, determined to get her personal life in order and find a new husband at all costs. The only problem is that 3 little ones aren't the most attractive asset on the dating market. So my sister came up with the brilliant solution of constantly dumping the kids on me. At first, it was just a couple of hours on a date. Katya, I met someone at the chocolate shop. Could you watch the kids for an hour? Then those hours turned into evenings. Evenings at a sleepover. And over the past year, I've practically become a foster mother to my nephews. Sasha is the eldest golden child. Calm, reasonable, and helps with the younger ones. If it weren't for him, I would have definitely gone crazy. But even with his help, juggling 3 kids and work is like juggling flaming torches while standing on one leg. Irina rents a 3-room apartment downtown and receives a decent amount of alimony from her ex. She works at some marketing firm. Maybe 20 hours a week. No more. And yet, like a fool, I still help her financially. Her parents also regularly give money to this poor divorcee with 3 children. Let me tell you what my typical day looks like. I wake up at 6:00 a.m. to get to work before the baby apocalypse begins. At 7:00 a.m., Irka drops her kids off by taxi, supposedly on her way to work. Although I suspect work often ends at the nearest cafe with her latest boyfriend. Then the marathon begins. Feed 3 children, each with their own food quirks, and dress them. Tioma, on principle, doesn't wear turtlenecks. Check their school bags and change of shoes. Then take them to school and kindergarten. Luckily, school no. 46 and kindergarten no. 112 are within walking distance of each other. Then I return home, and I have a full 4 hours to work. I need to get everything done before they get back. After lunch, my second shift starts. I have to pick up the kids. After-school programs are for those with extra money. Not Aunt Katya. I feed them and get them to do their homework. Sasha's doing okay. He can handle math on his own. But Emma has a hard time with Russian, and we spend an hour working on her exercises. Meanwhile, Tioma is usually building a fortress out of sofa cushions and fighting invisible enemies. Then checking the regular and electronic diaries is a whole other story. Sasha always has some kind of fundraising campaign in the class chat. Emma's teacher complains about her handwriting, and Tiomka's teacher asks him to bring wet wipes. Dinner for 4 has to be prepared by 7:00 p.m. Then there's bath time. That's a whole other quest. Because Tiomka's afraid to wash his hair, Emma only wants to bathe with bubble bath. Like a princess. And Sasha thinks she's too old for all that childish stuff. Putting my nephews to bed drags on until 1:00 p.m. Once everyone's asleep, that's when my real workday begins. I usually stay up until midnight. Sometimes even later, trying to catch up on all the tasks I didn't complete during the day. I've missed several deadlines already. It's unbelievable for my career, to say the least. The worst part is that my sister acts like this is completely normal. She never asks if I'm free or if it's convenient for me. She simply assumes I'll watch her kids whenever she wants. She'll send me a WhatsApp message. I'll pick the kids up for lunch tomorrow, and that's it. Sometimes tomorrow turns into the day after tomorrow, and by lunchtime into after 1:00 p.m. But that was all just the tip of the iceberg. Last Wednesday, Irka called at lunchtime. Katya, I always come to my parents for dinner on Saturday. I have an important announcement. The whole family needs to be here. Can't I tell you now? No. Only in front of everyone. Believe me, you'll be interested. I had no idea what she was planning, but curiosity got the better of me. Maybe she'd finally found a decent man to help her with the kids. That would be the best news I'd had in months. On Saturday, I went to visit my parents in Severny. There was an unfamiliar car parked in the yard, apparently a guest's. I walked into the house and saw Urka with the kids, my parents, and some guy I'd never met before in the living room. He looked about 30, average height, trim, with a receding hairline and a nervous smile. Katerina. Urka jumped up and went to hug him. I'm so glad you came. This is Dennis. Dennis stood up and extended his hand. It's very nice. Ira told me a lot about you. Everyone sat down to dinner. Mon cooked, as usual, for a company of soldiers. Olivier Salel, herring under a fur coat, and baked pink salmon. The children were surprisingly calm. And this should have been my first warning sign. Something momentous was about to happen. Somewhere in the middle of dinner. I couldn't resist asking. Okay. So what's the big announcement? My sister cleared her throat, took Denise's hand, and beamed. Dennis and I have some wonderful news to share with you. She paused dramatically, then said, I'm pregnant. And Dennis and I are getting married soon. A deathly silence fell over the room. For about 5 seconds. We all digested this information. Then the parents let out a joyful whoop and rushed to hug the newlyweds. Dennis smiled awkwardly and accepted the congratulations. I sat there, stunned dead. Erica can barely cope with 3 children as it is, working part-time and living on child support and parental handouts. And she's decided to have a 4th. Congratulations. I finally managed to say, that's news. Thank you, Katya. But that's not all. My sister turned to me with that smile that always makes my eye twitch. I need you to take the children with you for a few months while I carry the baby and recover from the birth. I choked on my compote. What? But this is temporary. You understand. So I can focus on the pregnancy, take care of my health, and then, when the baby is born, I'll need time to adjust. Ira, are you completely out of your mind? The smile vanished from her face instantly. What? I'm sorry? You expect me to raise your 3 children for months, on top of everything I'm already doing for them? Katya, there's nothing wrong with helping your nephews. Help, I'm practically raising them now. I feed them, dress them, do their homework, take them to their activities. My sister's eyes filled with tears. I can't believe you're so selfish. Do you only think about yourself? I turned to my parents, expecting them to talk some sense into their eldest daughter. But Mom looked at me sternly. Katya, you don't have children of your own. You don't understand how hard it is. I stared at her. I don't understand. I've been dealing with them all year. That's different. Dad interjected. Or is it our support that's needed now? But I don't. What about my work? My life? I asked. If Ira wants to have another child, Mom said gravely, she should have that opportunity without her family judging her. I got up from the table, meaning she could do it without my help. I grabbed my bag and headed for the exit, accompanied by Urka's sobs and my parents' cries about family responsibilities and duty to their families. I rode home in a taxi, completely furious. And by the time I opened the apartment door, my phone was already ringing off the hook with angry messages. Ira wrote, "You're a monster. How can you be so heartless?" From your mom, Katya. You should be ashamed. You need to help your family. Then Dad. Daughter. You're being unreasonable. Ira needs support right now, not your selfishness. I didn't respond to a single message. I thought they'd calm down and realize how idiotic Urka's request was to take her 3 children for a few months, while she settled in with her new husband and carried the 4th child, for the first time in a long time. I turned off my phone and went to bed early. The following week was the quietest I've had in a year. Noir. No calls from my parents trying to taunt me. Just me, my work, and blessed silence. I completed all my projects on time, even exceeding my plan for some tasks. Even my boss recognized my productivity and promised a bonus at the end of the quarter. For the first time in months, I felt like a good professional again. Not a tired old horse. But I should have known this idol wouldn't last. On Saturday morning, I was awakened by a persistent knock on the door. The clock showed 8:30. I got out of bed in my pajamas and looked through the peephole. My 3 nephews were standing at the door with suitcases. I immediately threw the door open. What are you doing here? The children looked confused and scared. Sasha was holding Emma's hand, and Tyoma was hugging a teddy bear. Mom brought us, Sasha said quietly. She let us out of the taxi, put our suitcases down, and told us to wait 5 minutes and then knock. She said you'd take care of us. She left you alone at the door. We weren't alone for long, Sasha quickly added. But we didn't know what to do. I brought them into the apartment, sat them down in the kitchen, poured them some juice, and poured out some cereal. Then I called my sister. The phone rang about 10 times before she answered. What do you want? Ira, you left your children unattended. Anything could have happened to them. Oh. Stop being so dramatic. It was only 5 minutes. You would have taken them anyway. Are you completely crazy? Listen. Katya. I know you'll give in and help. You always do. Children need stability. Go ahead. Take them. Urka said calmly. Come and take them yourself. Right now? I can't. Dennis and I have plans for today. And she hung up. I immediately called Mom. Mom. Urka just dropped the kids off at my door and left for Mant. There was a pause. Katya. Your sister is trying to build a life with Dennis. She needs to focus on her relationship right now. And she doesn't need to focus on her current children. I said loudly. You need to stop being so selfish and help your family. I hung up, completely bewildered. 20 minutes later, there was another knock on the door. This time, it was 2 police officers. Hello? We received a call that you were planning to kick 3 minor children out of the house. What? No. That's complete nonsense. The caller claimed you refused to let your nephews into your home. I couldn't believe it. Urka really did call the police on me. Sorry. That's not how it happened. This morning, my sister brought her children here and left them unattended at the door. Is that true? One of the officers turned to Sasha. Sasha nodded. Mom brought us with our things and told us to wait until she left and then knock on Aunt Katya's door. Actually, I said, I have a recording from a security camera. I remembered. You can wait a minute. I installed a camera at the door 2 months ago, after several apartment break-ins in our neighborhood. I didn't tell my family about it. I opened the recording on my phone and showed it to the police. It was clearly visible. Urka dragged the suitcases to my door, said something to the children, and then left, leaving them standing alone outside my apartment. This is clearly child neglect. One of the officers stated. Violation of child support obligations. You'll be filing a report, said the second. I will, and I want the guardianship authorities to handle this. The police took a detailed statement from me and the children and took a copy of the video recording. The children can stay with you for now, but the guardianship authorities will have to conduct an investigation, the elder explained. The next day, Zana Andreevna, a specialist from the guardianship and trusteeship department, came to my house. A serious-looking woman of about 50. She carried a folder of documents. She spoke with the children and me separately, asked about our living conditions, and inspected my apartment. As far as I understand, the children spend most of their time with you. Unfortunately, yes. My sister regularly brings them to me when she's not home, and you provide them with financial support. I buy them clothes, pay for their clubs and activities, and help with school supplies. My sister receives child support, but it doesn't seem to be going towards supporting the children. Zhana Andreevna took notes and said she'd open a case for review to assess the conditions the mother creates for the children. That evening, Urka burst into my room without knocking. You've set child protection services on me. I've completely lost my mind. She screamed. You left 3 children unattended on the street. That's called neglect of parental responsibility. Because of you, they'll take my children away. Maybe it's for the best. Urka's face turned red. I'm taking the children home. Not right now. The police and child protection said they're staying here until the situation is resolved. You can't keep my children. I'm not keeping them. You abandoned them when you abandoned them outside my apartment. She ran out, slamming the door. And half an hour later, her parents called. Katya, you've ruined everything. Mom wailed. Your sister's children could be taken to an orphanage. Actually, Mom, their father, Dmitri, called me yesterday. Child Protection Services contacted him and informed him of the incident. He wants to take the children back with him. He's tired of paying child support while Urka dumps the kids on relatives. He's planning to sue to determine where the children live with him. There was silence on the other end of the line. He'll stop paying and take the children back with him. Honestly, that's the best option. The parents hung up. I looked at my nephews. They were watching cartoons in the living room. For the first time in a long time, they looked calm and happy. The children lived with me for the next 3 months while the child protection authorities investigated and the court proceedings were being prepared. And you know what? It was the most stable period in their lives in years. Without Urkia's constant raids, we settled into a normal routine. I worked in the mornings while they were at school and preschool. I picked them up at 3:00, helped them with their homework, made dinner, and then finished work after lights out. Sasha, Emma, and Tioma were happier than I'd ever seen them. They knew exactly what to expect from each day. They didn't wonder when mom would disappear again. Their father, Dmitri, called regularly and inquired about the children. Kutya, I want you to know how grateful I am. I had no idea Ira was constantly bringing the children to you. We've been living like this for over a year. I whispered, I'm so sorry. I paid child support, thinking she really cared about the children. Dima said, most of it went toward her date and shopping. Apparently, everything will change soon. I said, my lawyer believes we have a strong case for determining the children's place of residence with me. He added, finally, the day of the trial arrived. I had to take time off to testify. The courtroom of the Khabarovsk Central District Court was packed. Sitting in the room were Urka and Denis, Dmitri with his lawyer, my parents, a representative of the guardianship authorities, and the children's teachers. Irina spoke first. She testified that she loved her children and wanted to continue raising them the same way she always had. I love my children. I'm a good mother. She sobbed. I just needed help during a difficult time in my life. Her lawyer tried to portray me as an evil woman who interfered in what wasn't her business and manipulated the situation to take the children away from their loving mother. Then they gave the floor to Dmitri, Your Honor. I paid child support faithfully for 2 years, believing that my ex-wife was raising our children. Now it turns out that my former sister-in-law, Ekaterina, was actually raising them while Ira was busy arranging her personal life. Then they called me to testify. Ekaterina Sergeevna, describe a typical week with the children over the past year. I have them with me 5 to 6 days a week. I feed them, do their homework, buy them clothes, pay for their extracurricular activities. Irina drops them off in the morning and picks them up. When will they remember? Did you agree to this? Not exactly. It just sort of happened. Every time I tried to refuse, Irina would throw a fit, and my parents would call me selfish. Tell me about the morning of the incident. Irina left her children unattended at my apartment door and left. She told them to wait 5 minutes and then knocked. So, they were completely alone. The children's teachers were called one by one. Sasha Patrushev's homeroom teacher, Galina Ivanovna, testified that I was listed as his emergency contact and attended all parent-teacher meetings. Emma's teacher confirmed the same thing. Even Tioma, the teacher, said, she turns to me with all her questions. Irka's parents tried to defend her, but their testimony was weak. Irina is a good mother. She's just going through a difficult time right now. The mother said, she's building a stable life with a new partner. The father added, but when the judge asked them directly how often the children stayed with me, they hesitated and couldn't give a clear answer. Dmitri's lawyer filed a motion to add the video recording to the case file. The judge granted the motion and reviewed the recording. You could see his expression change as he realized what had happened. Then, my sister's WhatsApp messages with me were presented as evidence, all those messages in which she demanded that I take the children away for a few months because she needed to focus on her new relationship. A representative of the Child Protection Authorities read out the report of the inspection of the children's living conditions on both sides and recommended that the children be handed over to their father. Irina's lawyer tried to argue that it was normal for relatives to help raise the children, but the judge was adamant. There's a difference between occasional childcare and actual abandonment of parental responsibilities, he said. After 2 days of hearings, the judge retired to make his decision. A week later, we reconvened in the courtroom. Based on the evidence presented, the judge read, the court determines the residence of the 3 minor children with their father, Dmitry Pavlovich Mikhailov. Urka burst into tears. The parents sat as if thunderstruck. Dmitry breathed a sigh of relief and nodded gratefully to me. The court found that the defendant systematically evaded her parental responsibilities, shifting them to relatives. Cases of child abandonment demonstrate a disturbing lack of common sense regarding the safety of minors. Child support payments from the father are terminated. The father assumes full financial responsibility for the children. End of story. A few weeks later, Dima took the children to live with him in Moscow. He has a 3-room apartment in a new building on Turgenevo. He furnished each child with their own room. He registered the children, registered them with a clinic, and enrolled them in a school and kindergarten near the house. The move went surprisingly smoothly. The children always loved their father and were finally happy to have some stability. They still come to visit me on weekends. Sasha once said, "Tot Katya, I'm much happier now. No need to wonder where I'll be spending the night tomorrow." Ika married Denis. It was a modest wedding at the Legislative Assembly, with about 10 guests. They didn't invite me, which was fine with me. A few months later, she gave birth to their 4th child. My parents stopped speaking to me after the trial. They accused me of breaking up Urka's family, even though I was simply protecting the children. But I don't care. My nephews are safe, stable, and happy with a father who truly wants to raise them. I believe I did the right thing. Sometimes protecting children means making difficult decisions that others won't understand. But these children deserved better than being a hindrance to their mother's personal life. 6 months have passed. After the trial, my life changed dramatically. For the first time in a long time, I lived entirely for myself. I could work normally, get enough sleep on weekends, and make plans without worrying about a sudden get the kids here or get the kids here immediately. My career took off, which I didn't expect. Without constant distractions and late-night work, I took on more challenging projects. My boss promoted me to development team leader. It was a significant raise. Plus, I got to work on AI projects. I even started dating. I met Roman at the high workload conference in Moscow. He's also a programmer and lives in St. Petersburg. When I told him about my nephews, he was shocked. "You basically raised 3 kids while working full-time," he said. "That's kind of feat." Of course. It was exhausting. I don't know how single parents cope. Most single parents don't have relatives who would take advantage of them so blatantly. Roma was right. I'd taken this completely abnormal situation for granted for so long that I'd forgotten what normal life looked like. The children flourished under their father's care. Dmitry enrolled them in a good school. All 3 became more confident and calm. Sasha won the city math Olympiad. Emma joined the school choir. Tioma plays for the DUS youth soccer team. They came to visit me several times a year during the fall and spring breaks, and for a month in the summer. Now our relationship was much better. Instead of a harassed woman always behind schedule, I could simply enjoy spending time with them. We went to the movies, to the Amur embankment, or just played PlayStation at home. Aunt Katya, "Are you happy now?" Sasha asked me during one of his visits. "You don't look so tired anymore." "Yes, I'm happy." "And how are you living with Dad?" "Great." Emma chimed in. "Dad cooks dinner every night and helps with homework. And we don't have to guess where we'll be tomorrow." This confirmed that moving was the right decision for everyone. Urka, on the other hand, wasn't having the best of times. I learned from my cousin Lisa that her marriage to Denis was falling apart. It turned out she had to raise a child on her own without the option of leaving him with relatives. It wasn't like going out to coffee shops for dates. She later had to take a full-time job. Child support payments had stopped. Denis works as a sales manager. The salary isn't great. Lisa told me that Urka asked her relatives for help, saying she couldn't afford diapers. But everyone already knows the story. There were no volunteers. My parents still haven't spoken to me. Honestly, it's for the best. I'm tired of the constant pressure to elicit pity whenever I try to set boundaries. But the rest of my family has warmed up. My cousin Maxim called a few months after the trial. "Katya, I'm so sorry. We all saw how Urka was using you. But no one wanted to get involved. Family is inconvenient." "Thank you, Max. What you did took courage. The kids are really doing better now. And maybe this lesson will be useful to Urka. She'll learn responsibility for the end." A year after the trial, I bought my own apartment. A 3-room apartment in a new building in Zaporino with a large kitchen, living room, and office. I invited Dmitri and the kids to the housewarming party. Aunt Katia, you have it so great here. Tioma was running around the rooms. Can we spend the night? Of course. You'll always have rooms here when you come visit. Dmitri called me out to the balcony while the kids explored the apartment. Katya, I can never thank you enough for what you've done. I know it cost you your relationship with your parents and sister. It was already unhealthy. I'm better off without this drama. The kids are doing great. Sasha got straight A's last term. Emma's teacher said he was one of the best students. They were always good kids. They just needed stability. First they got it from me. Now from you. You saved them from years of chaos. Looking back, I realized standing up to Urka was the best decision I ever made. Not just for the children, but for myself as well. I spent years neglecting her out of guilt and a desire not to cause trouble. But sometimes being a good aunt, sister, or daughter means saying no to arrogant demands. My sister was sure I'd always be an unpaid babysitter because I'd never refused before. She thought she'd go so far as to simply abandon the children with me, since I always gave in to small things. But there comes a time when you have to choose between giving in to someone's selfishness or protecting those who suffer from it. These 3 children deserved better than being a burden in their mother's personal life. They deserved a parent who truly wanted to raise them, not one who saw them as obstacles to overcome. Now they have that, and I have my life. I'm proud of my choice. Yes. It was hard. Yes. I lost some relationships, but it was the right decision. Sometimes standing up for justice means accepting that some people will never forgive you. But living honestly is worth more than maintaining a relationship built on manipulation and guilt. I was finally free to build the life I wanted. And that was better than any family approval. Story 2. My parents kicked me out of the house because I didn't want to pay my brother's debt. But when they found out what I spent the money on, the scandal was epic. My parents have always had a very particular way of measuring the value of their children. A way that of course never favored me. Since I can remember, I was always the one who did things well. The one who got good grades. The one who didn't cause problems. The one who, in short, showed with actions that I deserved respect and recognition. But at home that was never enough. When on the other side was my older brother, the eternally protected, the untouchable, the one who no matter how many mistakes he made always found a way to be exonerated, always had an excuse ready to justify his failures, always found in my parents the perfect accomplices to clean up his messes the last time they tried to make me bear their mistakes. However, everything changed this time. I was not the docile girl who silently accepted. This time I did not let myself be dragged by the family narrative of that. It was my duty to fix what he had broken, and that as expected was not well received in his world where things were handled with rules imposed by them, and where loyalty was nothing more than a chain that tied me to their designs. The simple fact of refusing to be my brother's savior was seen as an unforgivable betrayal. It all started when my mother, with that tone between pleading and manipulation that she also knew how to use, called me one night to tell me that I had to go home. Immediately, I remember her trembling voice, her way of breathing with heaviness, as if he were on the verge of collapse. He told me about a serious problem, something that needed to be resolved as soon as possible. To the need to act like a family, because that's what brothers do. They help each other. He said it in a way that any person with a minimum of empathy would have felt obliged to respond, but I, who had already seen that scene repeated too many times, already knew that every time they talked about family they really meant sacrifice your well-being for your brother. I didn't fall into the trap. I asked directly, what was going on? What was the urgency that they needed from me? And it was then when the truth came to light. My brother, as expected, had gotten into money trouble again. It was not the first time, nor as far as I could foresee, would it be the last. Before he had had debts that mysteriously disappeared. Before he had had bad luck in his businesses, and somehow there was always someone willing to rescue him, someone who ended up paying the price for his bad decisions. But this time the situation, it seemed more serious. My mother spoke of numbers that made me shudder. Numbers that were not simply the type of debt that is acquired through carelessness or impulsive spending, but something much bigger. Something that suggested that behind it all, there was a much deeper problem, and the worst thing was that according to her, I was the only one who could solve it. She didn't ask me immediately. She wasn't direct because she knew that if she did, I would refuse without hesitation. Instead, she began to remind me of all the times I had counted on my brother. The times that he had been there for me. Like when we were children and he protected me from the children at school, as if I hadn't learned to defend myself. Or, like when he helped me in difficult situations, as if that help hadn't been due to problems caused by himself, reminded me that he was in a bad moment. That he was desperate. That if he didn't pay that debt, his life would be seriously affected. That there were dangerous people involved, and that if we didn't act quickly, the situation could get out of control. He told me that I had stability. That I had a good job. That I could do it without problem, that it was just a transfer, that as soon as my brother was stabilized, he would return the money to me, that it was just a loan between brothers, something that we would do if we were really guilty. Didn't let his words build in me that false sense of obligation. I simply told him that I didn't. I told him that I understood that the situation was difficult, but that it wasn't my responsibility to fix it. I told him that my money was mine, that I had worked hard to have it, that I hadn't made mistakes, that I didn't have to pay for the bad someone else's decisions. And in that moment, his tone changed from pleading to ignition, to manipulative sweetness, to suppressed fury. He said he couldn't believe I was so selfish. He couldn't believe I wouldn't want to help my brother when he would do the same for me. A lie so obvious, I nearly burst out laughing. He accused me of being cold, of having become a mean person, of having forgotten what family meant. Then came the threat. If I didn't help him, if I didn't pay the debt, if I didn't do the right thing, then they would have no choice but to walk away from me. In other words, either I gave them the money or they would kick me out of their lives. The decision for me was not difficult. Not after so many years of seeing how things worked in that house. Not after understanding that for them, love was conditional, that it only existed as long as I was willing to be the one who sacrificed everything for others. So I told them that it was okay if my only role in their lives was to be their financial support. Then it made no sense to continue in that family, and I hung up. The next day, my father called me. I was not surprised to find the same anger disguised as disappointment in her voice. She told me if I wasn't willing to help, then there was no point in me being part of the family anymore. She said if I didn't want to act like a daughter, then I also didn't have the right to continue enjoying what they gave me. She said it as if I was taking something important away from me, as if she really believed that I depended on them, as if I couldn't live without their approval. And when I answered with a simple, okay, there was a heavy silence on the other end of the line, as if nothing. They might think I was actually challenging them. But I was, and I would do it until the very end. They kicked me out of the house without hesitation, and convinced that they were teaching me a lesson, that sooner or later I would come back, regretful, that I had no choice but to give in. But what they didn't know, what they never imagined, was that I wasn't going to just stand idly by. Not this time. Not when I had the perfect opportunity to do more than just walk away. Not when I had the chance to make them pay for it. All because after so many years of being treated like a second-class daughter, after so many times in which they took advantage of me, after so many sacrifices that were never valued, the time had come to show them what it really meant to lose someone. And not only lose me, but lose everything they had built based on lies and manipulations. The time had come for revenge. Update. A week had passed since my parents kicked me out of the house, and far from feeling desolate or lost, the only thing I felt, it was a burning rage that fueled every memory of humiliation. Every time I was relegated to a secondary role within my own family, I had been made to feel worthless beyond anything I could contribute. That my only usefulness was to be my brother's support, the convenient solution to their problems, the person they could dump all their responsibilities on without even bothering to ask me if I was okay with it. But this time, when they decided to push me aside as if I was expendable, they didn't realize that they were giving me exactly what I needed. Freedom to act without any restrictions, without feeling obliged to maintain the balance in a relationship that from the beginning was always destined to break. After that last conversation with my father, in which his threat to kick me out of the family was answered with an indifference that he never expected, I knew that I had no reason to regret. If something had become clear to me over the years, it was that my place in that house had never been secure, that my permanence was subject to the conditions that I had not accepted, and that deep down, I always knew that the day would come when I would have to choose between continuing to be his puppet or taking control of my life. And now that the choice was made, the only thing left was to decide what to do with all the information I had in my hands. The first days were strange. I had managed to stay in a friend's apartment, someone who cared enough not to ask uncomfortable questions and who understood without needing explanations that the probably last thing I wanted was to talk about what had happened. Even so, the feeling of emptiness was inevitable. Not because I missed my home, but because for the first time in a long time I had to get used to the idea that I was no longer obligated to respond to their demands. I didn't have to wait for the next call asking for favors. I didn't have to prepare for the next manipulation disguised as family concern. I didn't have to measure my words, for fear of triggering a crisis that would end with my mother crying and my father saying it was my fault. And although I knew it was a relief, it was also disconcerting. But that disconcerting didn't last long. My anger was stronger. My determination was greater. I wasn't going to stand idly by while they carried on with their lives while my brother found a way to get away with it once again. Not when I knew that behind all that facade of financial problems, there was something much murkier. Something that for the first time I had the opportunity to expose. I always knew that my brother had a strange relationship with money. It wasn't just that he was irresponsible, but that there was a pattern to the way the debts mysteriously disappeared, the way he never faced the real consequences of his actions. Ever since we were teenagers, he'd always counted on my parents for help with his problems. But the most disturbing thing was that he didn't even seem upset or ashamed. When someone had to pay for him, he acted like it was his right, as if the world owed him that indulgence, as if everyone around him was there just to make sure he never had to deal with the consequences of his own decisions. That's why, when my mom, she mentioned that this time the debt was with dangerous people, I couldn't help but wonder how deep he had dug himself into the mud. It wasn't the first time he had talked to me about his financial problems. But this time there was something different, something that made my mother sound more scared than usual. And although at the time I didn't give it the importance she expected, after a few days, I began to analyze it in more detail. If my brother really owed that much money, if he was in such a complicated situation, why weren't they moving with the desperation they should, instead of looking for all the possible ways to solve it? The only option they saw viable was to ask me with that idea in mind. I decided to start investigating. I knew it wasn't going to be easy. My parents weren't exactly the type of people who left obvious traces, and my brother, despite his irresponsibility, had the ability to hide his dirty laundry well. But something inside me told me that if I tried hard enough, if I dug in the right place, I would find something that would make them falter. My first step was to review everything I knew about their finances. Although I didn't have direct access to his accounts, I remembered details that seemed suspicious to me: loans that were never paid, investments that seemed non-existent, exorbitant expenses that no one could justify. With each piece of information, I remembered I was drawing a mental map of what could be happening. And then, almost by chance, I remembered something that completely changed my perspective. A few months ago, during a family meal, where, as usual, my brother monopolized the conversation with stories about his great business opportunities. He mentioned something about an investment in cryptocurrencies. He said it casually between laughs, as if he was joking, but at that moment it caught my attention, not because I believed he was an expert on the subject, but because his way of speaking to me sounded forced, as if he was trying to convince someone else that he knew what he was doing. Now that I thought about it in more detail, it made sense. If my brother had lost money in one of those fraudulent investments, if he had been scammed, or if he had simply I bet more than I could afford to lose, that would explain why the debt was so big, and most importantly, it would explain why my parents didn't want to talk too much about it. With that hypothesis in mind, I decided to contact someone who could help me confirm my suspicions. An old acquaintance who worked in financial analysis. Someone who knew how to track dubious movements and who, if I was lucky, could help me find concrete evidence. When I explained the situation to him, his reaction confirmed that I was on the right track. He told me that scams, with cryptocurrencies booming, there were hundreds of cases of people falling for promises of easy profits only to end up losing everything. He asked me if I had any clue as to which platform he might have invested in. But beyond the vague memory of that conversation at the family meal, I had no concrete information. Even so, he promised to investigate, and if he found something relevant, he would let me know. While I waited for his response, I began to think about my next step. It was no longer just about refusing to pay the debt. Now it was personal. Brother had actually lost a fortune in a fraudulent scheme, and my parents were trying to hide it, so I had the perfect opportunity to expose them, to make them face the truth for the first time in their lives. It was no longer just a matter of money. It was the opportunity to show them that they could no longer manipulate me, that they could no longer use me as their safety net. And this time, when the truth came out, there would be no way for them to escape the consequences. Update 2 had. It's been a month since my parents kicked me out of the house, and far from having tried any approach or having shown the slightest remorse for the way they decided to get rid of me, it seemed that the subject had become an issue that I preferred to ignore. I wasn't surprised. It was the same mechanism that they had used all their lives. When something bothered them, they acted as if the problem didn't exist, as if the absence of a conversation about the subject was enough to make reality disappear. However, what they didn't know was that I hadn't spent those weeks grieving or searching for a form of reconciliation. Instead, I had immersed myself in an investigation that was beginning to yield results. Results that, for the first time in my life, gave me an advantage over them. The days following my discovery of my brother's possible connection to cryptocurrency scams were spent reviewing any detail that could help me confirm it. I knew that if he wanted revenge, I couldn't rely solely on assumptions. I needed proof, hard facts that were impossible to refute, something that when it came to light would put them in such a compromising position that they couldn't just dismiss it as another one of their buried family secrets. So I got back in touch with the friend who was helping me with the financial side and asked him to focus on tracking down any suspicious activity related to my brother. He had more resources and knowledge than I could have hoped for and was quick to give me something to work with. The first day clue appeared in a recent transaction my brother had made from a secondary account that no one in the family seemed to pay much attention to. It was a significant payment to an address linked to a platform that had been reported on multiple forums for being a pyramid scheme disguised as a cryptocurrency investment. According to my contact, these types of transactions were usually a clear sign of someone desperately trying to recover their money, probably after realizing they had been scammed. And if my brother was in that situation, meant that his debt was not only to dangerous people, but he was also facing the harsh reality of having been another naive person in a system designed to empty his pockets with that information in hand. The next step was to find out if my parents knew the truth, or if they did. As so many other times, they were simply believing the version he gave them for, that I needed to approach someone within his circle, someone who could consciously or unconsciously. That gave me a clue that they knew neither that nor that, and it didn't take long for me to find the perfect person, my maternal aunt. The only one who, despite always having stayed away from family problems, had a tendency to talk too much. When she felt confident, I managed to get her to agree to see me under the excuse that she needed to talk to someone in the family. Someone who wasn't directly involved in the conflict with my parents. We met in a cafeteria, and as I expected, it didn't take long for her to start asking questions about what had happened. About whether I had really refused to help my brother. About whether she was sure that I wouldn't regret it. I let her talk. I let her express her opinion without interrupting her, until at some point in the conversation, when she had relaxed enough, she blurted out the information I was looking for. She told me that my parents were upset that the situation with my brother was much more serious than they wanted to admit, and that the reason they pushed me so hard was because they had exhausted all other options. She said that they had tried get money in different ways. They even considered selling a property to cover the debt, but my brother insisted that they shouldn't do it, that there was another way, that everything would be solved soon. And most importantly, he mentioned that at no time had they talked about cryptocurrencies, that according to what they knew, the debt was related to a failed investment in a legitimate business. That confirmed my suspicions. My brother had lied to them. He had covered up his own stupidity with another story, easier to digest, something that wouldn't make my parents see it as what really. He was a man incapable of accepting his own mistakes. An irresponsible man who preferred to make others assume the consequences rather than face them himself. But now that I knew for sure, I had the final piece I needed to execute my plan. It was no longer just about exposing him, but about making my parents realize once and for all that the person they had been protecting for years, they had defended him. They had treated him as if he were the victim of a series of misfortunes and not as the true culprit of his own ruin. But this time, when everything came to light, if they saw the truth in its rawest form, there would be no way for them to justify it. The next step was to get all the information to the right place. It wasn't enough to confront my parents in private. It was useless for me to tell them the truth if in the end, they could simply minimize it as another tantrum of mine. It had to be something public, something that would force them to confront it with no possibility of escape, and for that I needed the help of someone who could amplify the story, someone who knew how to make the truth reach as many people as possible. That's when I decided. I contacted a local journalist who had been investigating financial fraud cases in the city. I didn't know him personally, but I had read some of his articles and knew he had experience exposing fraudulent investment schemes. It took me a couple of days to get him to agree to meet with me. But when he finally did, and I showed him the evidence, his reaction was enough to know I had found the perfect ally. He told me the story had potential, that it wasn't just an isolated case, that it fit in with other recent scams, and that if I could get more details, I could put together a story that would not only expose my brother, but also help prevent more people from falling for the same thing. He warned me that publishing something like this wouldn't be immediate, that he would need time to corroborate some information, but that if everything was verified, there would be no going back. That was the first time in weeks that I felt like I was in control of the situation. It wasn't enough to know the truth. It wasn't enough to uncover the lies. I had to make sure everyone knew, that it wouldn't be left in the dust. A simple conversation, private at this time. When everything came out, there would be no way to hide behind excuses or manipulations. My brother had played with fire, but this time the fire he started would not be easy to put out. Update 3 months had passed since I last spoke to my parents, and in that time, the silence they had imposed on my existence had become the only reflection of their wounded pride for them. I had stopped being part of the family the moment I refused to give in, the moment I proved that I was not going to be. I wasn't the financial backing of my brother, nor the docile puppet they had hoped for, and while at first that silence felt like a bitter reminder of how easily I had been discarded as the week went by, it became a gift. Because while they pretended I didn't exist while convincing themselves they had made the right decision by expelling me from their lives, I pressed ahead with my plan, making sure that when they finally had to acknowledge my presence, it would be with an unbearable weight on them. Behind his back, the journalist I had spoken to weeks ago was quick to fulfill his part of the deal. He had been patient and meticulous, making sure that every piece of information I provided was backed up by verifiable evidence from documents and records that could not be denied with simple excuses. He wasn't satisfied with the information I gave him, but took the investigation further, finding connections that I myself hadn't noticed, tying up loose ends that made the story stop being just a family problem and become something much more complex, bigger. And when finally the article was ready, when I knew that in a matter of hours the world would be what my brother had been doing, I felt for the first time in a long time that the scales were tipping in my favor. The article was published on the most read news page in the city, and as I expected, it didn't take long for Vidal to become the title direct and provocative enough to capture anyone's attention. It broadly mentioned the case of a man who had lost a fortune in a cryptocurrency scam, accumulating a debt that he tried to cover up everything. Costa, even with his own family's money. He didn't mention names directly, but anyone who knew my brother, anyone who had been close to our family, could realize who the protagonist of the story was, and most importantly, it included details that only someone with access to privileged information could have provided, which meant that my parents would soon understand where the leak came from. The reactions were not long in coming. In a matter of hours, the comments began to accumulate, some mocking the stupidity of the investors who fell into this type of traps, others expressing their indignation at the impunity with which people like my brother tried to evade their responsibilities. But those that interested me most were those who came from closer circles of people who knew my family of friends and acquaintances, who suddenly began to ask uncomfortable questions that began to doubt the perfect image that my parents had tried to maintain for years. Because if there was one thing I was clear about, was that what hurt my parents, it was not the truth itself, but the fact that that truth was exposed, that they no longer had control over the narrative, that now it was others who were talking about them, who were pointing it out, who were whispering behind their backs without them being able to do anything to prevent it. The scandal grew more than expected. The story was taken up by other media, some adding additional details, others speculating about the identity of the man mentioned in the original article. Social networks were filled with comments, some from people who claimed to have heard rumors about the subject, others from who simply enjoyed seeing someone fall from grace. And in the midst of all that chaos, I knew that sooner or later I would receive the call I had been waiting for. It was not my mother who called first. She was always too proud, too attached to the idea that ignoring a problem made it go away. She was probably trying to convince herself that she could handle the situation without turning to me. But my father, more practical, more aware of what this scandal really meant for his image, was quick to dial my number, and when I saw his name appear on my phone screen, when I felt the insistent vibration that broke the silence in my room, I knew the moment had come. I didn't answer right away. I let it ring a few times before swiping my finger across the screen and answering. With such a neutral tone, I could almost feel his frustration on the other end of the line. His voice, that was normally firm, confident, now had a barely contained tinge of desperation. He asked me if it had anything to do with the article, if it was my way of getting revenge for what had happened, if I realized the damage that was causing it. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to defend my brother with the same old excuses. He knew he couldn't do it. He knew the evidence was there, that there was no way to turn this situation around. So instead, he tried to appeal to a sense of responsibility that had long since ceased to exist in me. He told me that the family shouldn't destroy each other, that this didn't just affect my brother but everyone, that my actions had put his reputation, his stability, his entire life at risk. And it was. So when I understood something that until that moment I hadn't wanted to admit to my parents, they never cared about the truth. They never cared that my brother was irresponsible, that he destroyed everything he touched, that his mistakes became the burden of everyone else. The only thing that mattered to them was that no one else found out. It didn't bother them that he was a disaster, as long as he could keep up the facade, as long as they could continue acting like everything was under control. But now that the scandal was public, now that the shame was reaching them without them being able to hide behind their perfect image, now they really cared. And that realization, more than anything else, was the confirmation that I had done the right thing. I didn't respond immediately to his claim. I let him talk, let him try to make me feel guilty, let him exhaust all the arguments he thought could make me doubt. And when he finally finished, when it was clear he was waiting for me to say something, for me to give him an out, I simply told him that I had nothing to discuss. I reminded him that they were the ones who kicked me out, the ones who left. Of course, they didn't consider me part of the family. And if I wasn't part of their family anymore, then it wasn't my problem what happened to them either. The silence that followed my words was long, thick, laden with a weight that could be felt even through the phone. And when he finally spoke again, his voice no longer held the same firmness. He said my name once, as if there was still something he could say to change my mind. But there wasn't. Not this time. So I hung up and let the silence do the rest. I knew this wasn't over. I knew there would be more calls, more damage control, more attempts to get me to back down. But I didn't care anymore. I'd spent years carrying the weight of their contempt. The weight of being the daughter who always had to give in, who always had to be the responsible adult, while they continued to protect my brother. And now, for the first time, they were the ones at the center of this disaster. And this time, I wasn't going to be the one to save him. Update: 4 months had passed since the last conversation with my father, since that call in which he tried to convince me that the damage caused by the truth was worse than the lie that they had protected for so long. I did not answer his attempts to contact me after that. At first, his insistence was aggressive with constant calls, messages in which he alternated between pleas and threats, desperate attempts to regain the control they had always had over me. But when they realized that I was not going to give in, when they understood that they could no longer manipulate me with the same old strategies, their tone changed, the calls became sporadic, the messages stopped demanding and began to disguise themselves as attempts at reconciliation, words carefully chosen to make me believe that after all, I was still part of the family, but for then there was nothing in me that could believe them. He had changed their lives in a way they never imagined, not only because the story had reached all the people who they had once been considered a respectable family, but the repercussions went far beyond the damage to his reputation. My father's company, which had always depended on his impeccable image and the trust he generated in his clients, began to lose contracts. Some partners preferred to distance themselves. Others decided to cut ties completely. It didn't take long for a rumor to spread that his son's financial problems could have been facilitated by family money. And although there was no concrete evidence of this in the business world, suspicions were enough to ruin someone. My mother, for her part, experienced an even more painful fall. Her whole life had revolved around maintaining an image of perfection, to being the woman who always had the right answer, the one who surrounded herself with the right people, the one who made sure that nothing and no one could tarnish her idea of what her family should be. But after the scandal, everything changed. Her friendships, those women with whom she shared her time at social events and charity meetings, began to distance themselves. They did not do it abruptly or openly, because at that world, exclusion is not expressed with direct words, but with invitations that stop coming, with calls that are never returned, with furtive glances that are diverted. When she entered a room, no matter how much she tried to pretend that nothing had changed, because it had, and the worst thing for her was that she had no one to blame but her own son. But if they had suffered the consequences of the truth, brother was the one who received the hardest blow. At first, he tried to deny everything. When the article came out and his name began to circulate among the speculations, his first action was his usual arrogance, the confidence with which he had faced all his previous crises, convinced that, as always, his family would find a way to get him out of trouble. He faced the accusations with disdain, assuring them that it was all an exaggeration, that the media was only looking for sensationalism, that he had not committed any crime. But what he did not understand, what he did not want to accept until it was too late, was that this time there was no easy way out. The investigations into the fraudulent schemes in which he had participated began. The people who, like him, had fallen into the trap of promises of quick money began to demand answers. Some of them, realizing that they would not be able to recover their money, were decided to talk, share their stories, expose details that until then had not been public. And in the midst of all this chaos, his name stopped being a rumor and became a fact, a key piece in a plot that not only pointed to him as a victim but also as a possible accomplice. It wasn't long before they appeared, leaked documents, screenshots of conversations and transfers that showed that his participation had not only been that of a naive, defrauded investor, but that at some point he had tried to involve other people, convincing them to invest in the same scheme as him. What had previously seemed like just a financial error began to transform into something much more serious, something that drew the attention not only of the media but also of the authorities. And when he finally received the first legal notification, when he learned that he could face charges and could not justify it, the origin of certain money movements, her attitude changed completely. It was then when, after months of silence, my mother finally looked for me. She did not do it with her usual arrogance, nor with the certainty of someone who believes that her daughter owes her something. She called me, in a tone that she had never used with me before, with a broken, desperate voice with a fragility that she would never have shown if it were not because she no longer had any other options. Told me that everything had gotten out of control, that they did not know what to do, that my brother was in worse trouble than they had imagined. She told me that the family did not. It had to be destroyed, that I couldn't be happy watching my own brother fall, that at the end of the day, no matter how many things had happened between us, he was still my blood. I let her speak. I listened to each of her words with the patience of someone who no longer feels anger or resentment but a cold indifference, because in that moment I understood everything. She didn't call me because she regretted what they had done to me, not because she realized that they had made a mistake in choosing me as the scapegoat for their disaster. She called me because she wanted me to do the same thing I had always done to fix the problem, sacrificing myself so that they wouldn't have to face the consequences. But this time there was nothing left in me that was willing to do it when she finally finished speaking, when she stopped, filling the silence with pleas wrapped in a disguise of maternal love. I simply answered her the only thing that made sense to say. I reminded her of her own words, those that she told me the day they kicked me out when they left me. Of course, I was no longer part of her family. I told her if in that moment her love for my brother was greater than any ties to me, then they had to continue down that path. They had to find a way to save him without me. They had to face the consequences of their decisions as they always demanded that I do it. There was no more insistence after that. There were no more calls or messages. Not because they finally understood, but because they knew that this time there was nothing they could do to manipulate. Reality had caught up with them, and now they had no choice but to bear the weight of their own actions. And for the first time in my life, I knew what true peace was. Final update: a year had passed since I last heard from my family. 12 months in which the echo of their pleas, their reproaches, and their attempts at manipulation had gradually faded until it became a distant noise, an irrelevant murmur within a life that finally felt like my own. During that time, many things had changed. The impeccable image that my parents had built over the years was destroyed. Not by an external attack, not by invisible enemies who wanted to harm them, but by the simple and devastating force of the truth. The truth that they feared so much. The one they tried to hide under lies and appearances. The one that, when it finally caught up with them, left no stone unturned in the bubble they had lived in for decades. After the scandal became public and the investigations into my brother began to take a more serious turn, my parents did everything they could to contain the damage. They hired lawyers. They tried to discredit the reports. They sought to ways to re-establish their status within the circles that had rejected them. But the reality was that in that world, once you fall from grace, there is no going back. No one wants to associate with a family marked by corruption. No one wants to risk their own reputation by helping someone whose family name has become synonymous with fraud and scandal. So slowly, they were left alone, trapped in the same bubble they had built for themselves. But this time without the artificial glitter that before made it impenetrable. My brother, for his part, lived the worst of the falls. During the first months, he tried to maintain the defiant attitude that had always characterized him, convinced that somehow he would find a way out, that there would be someone willing to rescue him. Like so many other times, but when he realized that my parents could no longer do it, when he understood that he no longer had the safety net that had always protected him, his facade began to crumble. He tried to negotiate, tried to avoid any responsibility. He tried to blame others. But no matter how many excuses he gave or how many attempts he made to evade the situation, the facts were the facts, and in the end, justice had no problem finding a way to make him answer for what he had done. The latest news I received about him came to me from external sources, people who, even without knowing the full story, felt that I should find out. They told me that after months of legal battles, and he had been found guilty on several charges related to fraud and swindle, financial, and that although the final sentence was still to be determined, his future did not look promising. I was not surprised, not because I expected life to punish him, but because at the end of the day, no one can escape forever from the consequences of their own actions. No matter how much they protect you, no matter how many times they rescue you, if you keep digging your own grave, eventually you fall into it. My parents tried to appeal to all possible instances. They spent the resources they had left on lawyers and strategies to reduce the sentence, but none of that changed the reality that their favorite son, the one for whom they sacrificed so much, the one for whom they were willing to deny their own daughter, was now completely alone. Not because I had abandoned him, but because the moment they stopped being able to protect him, all the people around him did the same. His friends, those with whom he used to brag about his money, those who accompanied him in his life of excesses, disappeared. Not because they were cruel, but because friendship based on interest disappears as soon as the interest ceases to exist. And so little by little, the family that was once my prison, the one that relegated me to a secondary role, The one that believed that my value only existed to the extent that I could serve them crumbled without me having to do anything more. Then let the truth do its work. There was no need for more revenge. There was no need for more movements on my part. Everything they built was based on lies, and when the foundation collapsed, the rest fell of its own weight. My life instead moved on with time. The rage that drove me in the beginning dissipated, not because I forgave them, not because I forgot what they did to me, but because I understood that holding on to that anger only chained me down and defined me. It wasn't easy to rebuild myself after spending so much time molded by what they wanted me to be. But with each passing day, with each decision I made for myself, without fear of their judgment, without the shadow of their expectations, I found a freedom I never knew I needed. The last time I heard about my parents was through a mutual acquaintance. He told me that they had sold the house we grew up in. After losing so many connections and resources, they decided to move to a smaller place far from the city, away from the stares and whispers that followed him wherever they went. He told me that my mother barely left the house, that she had lost the shine of superiority with which she had always handled herself. She told me that she was no longer the woman who dominated each room with her presence. She told me that my father, for his part, was still trying to find a way to recover what he lost, but that each attempt ended in failure because in his world, once you fall, it's almost impossible to get back up. I felt no joy when I heard all of that. I felt no satisfaction or pleasure for their misfortune. I only felt peace, because after everything they did, after all the harm they caused me, after all the contempt with which they treated me, their punishment was not something I caused, but something they brought upon themselves. And that more than anything else was the greatest proof that I had. 1. There was nothing that tied me to them anymore. There was nothing that, it made me look back with the feeling that there was still something left to resolve. Revenge doesn't always come in the form of active destruction. Sometimes the best revenge is simply watching those who hurt you fall under their own weight, without you having to do anything but get on with your life. And that was exactly what I planned to do.